How's it going, everyone? And welcome all in for another episode of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. Be sure to hit the subscribe button on YouTube, and then also follow along on all the social media platforms, unofficial WCC Pod, or just follow me at Post by Zach. Similar content on both of them, especially on Twitter. So go ahead and follow along there. The busiest part of this week, there's not a whole lot going on, but it is NBA draft week, and there are a couple of WCC names that are going to be part of the conversation, and one name in particular who has not only risen up draft boards, but is very much in the mix to hear his name called on night 2, more than likely, but who knows? We've seen a couple other recent WCC guys move up the draft boards even further in the later weeks. So we'll see how that all pans out. We'll talk to Thomas Dunn, who called Santa Clara for KSCU the past few seasons. We'll get his thoughts on Santa Clara and what they look like this past year, what they have coming back, and what really are the internal expectations of what this team is capable of doing down the road. And we'll start off with just a couple of notes about the schedule, some schedule changes, not necessarily changes, but some two marquee games that were announced. Actually, a few marquee games I'll just throw out there. St. Mary's, it was announced that they will be taking on Nebraska on November 17th, and that will be at the Pentagon in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. So that will be their I believe this is actually St. Mary's 5th trip to the Pentagon, and they are 3-1 in those past 4 trips. So this has been a place that has been a pretty good home for St. Mary's on the road. Obviously, playing Nebraska just a state away, so it'll probably be a heavy Nebraska crowd. But again, St. Mary's has played well in this building, and this is a really good, solid early test for St. Mary's as they continue to build up their non-conference schedule. Gonzaga also announced the date for the battle in Seattle, which will be against Kentucky, December 7th. That's a Saturday, so that will be at Climate Pledge Arena. And that's going to be a very busy WCC day as well. Already we know that it's the same day as St. Mary's at Utah. So two really good WCC matchups, marquee matchups. The Zags taking on Mark Pope's Kentucky Wildcats in Seattle. So it'll also be a reuniting of head coaches, Mark Few and Mark Pope. Obviously, Mark Pope being the former coach at BYU. And maybe one of the coaches that did give Mark Few fits. And that BYU team under Mark Pope did do, I think, much better than a lot of other teams, obviously, in the WCC. Even within that short period of time, I think they actually even played better against Gonzaga than even St. Mary's in his short tenure in the WCC/BYU. And we're starting to see these schedules start to fill out. We're starting to see what that's going to look like. We know that what Gonzaga's schedule is already starting to look like. We know about Kentucky. We know about the battle for Atlantis. Washington actually was another news breaking just this past week that they actually are pulling out of the rest of the contract for Gonzaga, which was something that was part of the original contract, that if there was a new head coach that they were able to have an opt-out of the rest of the dates scheduled between the two squads, and that is what is going to happen. So there will be no Washington Gonzaga this coming year. That sort of thing doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I mean, why would you not want, if you're Washington, why would you not want to play a team that's likely in the top 10? That is a short trip for you. You don't have to travel all that far. It's only going up and over the hill to Spokane. But I guess maybe they somehow didn't want to play a team that was better than anyone in their new conference. All that said, we know Washington has not really fared all too well against Gonzaga over the last 15 years. They did get a win last year against the Zags, a Zag team at that point that was really kind of struggling in a lot of ways. They didn't shoot well. That was just a game that's really just kind of felt weird. Watching it as that game kind of flowed along, that was not a Gonzaga team we're used to seeing play in that game. But all that said, the matchup is off. Gonzaga will have another opportunity to kind of fill that game in with another team, and of course, we know that this Gonzaga squad knows how to refill in games as needed. Again, this is a team that already has San Diego State, Kentucky, UConn, UCLA, and then the Battle for Atlantis on the schedule as is. And speaking of on the schedule, as we again mentioned, the NBA draft is this week, so that is where we're going to have our start of the focus, and it's going to largely be on Jonathan Mogbo, because his name, much like we have seen the last couple of years with Jalen Williams, with Brandon Pajemski from Santa Clara, that we have seen a WCC name really kind of shoot up the draft board. I would say, and I would have been alone in this assessment, that going into the offseason, the Jonathan Mogbo as an NBA prospect, I thought was a little premature. Did I think there was potential there? Absolutely. Like, you could clearly see the skill sets that would translate to the next level. Athletic, he can handle the ball. He's a playmaker. We hadn't seen much of his shooting, which I think was, for me, definitely the biggest question mark, was whether or not he could actually shoot for his size. Again, being a little bit of a smaller big man, you have to be able to kind of stretch out to the 3-point line. I think he took all of one 3-pointer, if he did even took one this past season. So there was, for me, that was a big question mark. But as we saw him go through the draft combine, go through all of the workouts, it really does seem that teams are really starting to like him, and he has gone from really kind of like draft unknown altogether to someone who has continued to just move up, and just looking in the latest, a handful of mock drafts for the NBA for the draft coming up, 52, 42, 39. I've seen as high as 33. So just outside of the first round for Jonathan Mogbo. And I think he's one of those guys right now. So you kind of know what he is defensively. Like, he is, and WCC fans saw this, he's everywhere defensively. Like, he can guard one-on-one. He knows how to rebound well. He knows how to defend in space. Like, his hands are everywhere. Again, this 6'9" forward who has a 7'2" wingspan. This is a player who will have a lot of value on the defensive end at the next level. Question is going to be, and again, maybe as a second round pick, he has time to kind of develop parts of his game, is that getting that more consistent offensive aggression on the perimeter, and being able to be a playmaker a little bit more, because we know he can be a playmaker. We saw him, and I talked with Coach Chris Gerlifson just last week about this very thing, that as the season went along just this past year, you saw more of the skills and more of the skill set that Jonathan had. You saw more of the ball handling. You saw more of the playmaking. We still did not see that shot, but we saw everything else, that he does a lot of the little things well, that as a second round pick for a team that's looking maybe for a high upside player, maybe a little bit more, not just like a full project, but a guy who's going to do a lot of the little things right while he works on other parts of his game. He's a player that can help you win games. And there's never been a concern to me about his defense, about his effort, about his work, about all those things. The concern for me was whether or not offensively he would be aggressive enough and be efficient enough to play at that next level. Because we didn't see him play well all against Gonzaga. We didn't see him play well against St. Mary's. We did not see him play well against Santa Clara. He offensively was a little bit more like invisible in those games against good teams. And a lot of times I want to look at film and let that kind of tell the story for me, because that tells me what type of player you are or what you might look like at the next level. Obviously, NBA teams are starting to see more of that offensive game. I've seen some video clips, highlight reels or whatnot of some of those workouts and some of what we are starting to see. And obviously it's highlight reels. It's hard. You kind of take those with a grain of salt, because you kind of get, obviously you're going to get the best of the best in some of those looks. But this is a guy that I think there's potential there. If he gets picked, and it does look like more and more that he will get picked, that he is going to be probably a G League guy early on. He's going to have to show that he can consistently be an offensive weapon. Him being kind of like, and again, he'll be an undersized 4 in the in the NBA. He's not quite there as a 3. He doesn't shoot well enough to be a 3, or doesn't. We have not seen him shoot. We don't have the evidence to see that he's that sort of guy on the offensive end as a 3. But as a 4, I think that there's a lot to like about what Jonathan Mogbo is capable of. But I also think that there's maybe a bit of a higher risk here, because the one thing you have to be able to do in the league is score. Because if you become a liability on the offensive end, you just become basically a cone on the floor, and really not a threat at all. And defenses in the NBA are too good. The athletes in the NBA are too good to kind of just let you sit there and do nothing, and that really just hurts your team. So it really does look like we're going to see his name called, not on night 1, but on night 2. So that would be Thursday. We're going to see his name likely called somewhere. I've seen as high as 33. I've seen as low as 52. But he is now starting to appear on almost every draft board. And if he's starting to appear on almost every draft board and not like toward the end in the 50s, and he's in the 40s and the 30s, I think you could almost rest assured that he is going to have his name called during the NBA draft. The other name that I've not seen on any draft board, which I wonder why that might be, and maybe that's talk about like ceilings. Jonathan Mogbo, I think, does have a pretty high, has a good size ceiling. Anton Watson is maybe the guy that I would say his ceiling isn't as high, but his floor is higher than what Jonathan Mogbo probably is right now. We know exactly what Anton Watson is. I know exactly what Anton Watson is. He's a great defender. He's a really good rebounder. I know what he can do offensively. I've seen him take over games against good teams. I've seen him shoot from the mid-range. I've seen him work in the post. I've seen him bang with bigger players. I've seen him guard smaller players. I've seen him be able to step outside and shoot a 3 when necessary. I've seen kind of a little bit of everything from Anton Watson. And the role that he filled for Gonzaga was doing all the dirty work, doing all the little things to help you win. And we know that obviously, like, Anton Watson is not going to be a star in the NBA, but he is a guy who I think would have a lot of value for a team in the league. And he also seems like the type of guy who's going to end up, again, he'll go undrafted, but then that gives you almost a little bit more flexibility about where you go and who might be interested, because then it's going to be about fit. And do you go to the right team? Do you go to the right situation, the right coaching staff, the right development staff? Are you in a situation that is going to actually utilize what he does well in an environment where he can develop into a better player based in that system? Again, like, I'm not going to quite say like, oh, like Miami, because like Miami turns those guys around pretty quickly. I'm not going to go there, but I think there's a good number of teams that probably would actually kind of serve him well based on what the team as a whole does need. I mean, I think of like you need guys who are going to do the dirty work. OKC might actually make a lot of sense for that squad. They just recently made a trade for Alex Caruso for a guy that fills a lot of the holes that they needed. They needed another lockdown defender. They need someone who's going to do the dirty work. They have plenty of stars at this point. What they need are guys who are going to do the little things. And so that's a location. And also with a couple of WCC guys already, that might make a lot of sense. Miami, yes, probably also makes a lot of sense. I think Indiana, to a lesser extent, makes some sense as well, where it's like they are a team that's going to have to do a lot of the little things right. And we saw in the playoffs that kind of got away from them later on. But that's a team that I think could actually use someone like Watson to be able to kind of do those things. And also kind of like look at teams that maybe are a little bit more athletic generally, so that it doesn't have to be all on someone like Watson when he comes into the game. There's a little bit more of a balance on that front. I'd have to really think about a little bit more. It's like, I mean, even actually a team like Sacramento could potentially use someone like that. You look at some of the other pieces that they have, De'Aaron Fox, they bring back Malik Monk. You do have Kevin Huerter, and you have Sabonis there. So there are some, I think, pieces there that actually might make some sense where Anton Watson could slide right in and really do well in that system for Mike Brown in a coaching staff that I think is going to develop them well. And going into, so that's really the two guys that we know are going to be part of the NBA draft this coming year. We also know there's a slew of guys in the league that are probably going to be in the conversation come next year's draft. I mean, just thinking about Adama Ball had gone through the process. Michael Ajayi had already gone through the process. Javon Porter is a name that I talked about last year for a lot of the season as being a potential NBA guy and maybe one of the higher ceiling. Actually, last year, probably the highest ceiling guy going into the college basketball season a year ago. Obviously, Ryan Nembhard's going to be part of that conversation. Graham Ike will be part of that conversation. There's a good number of guys, I think, that are going to be part of that conversation going into next year's NBA draft. Long way to go to try to figure out who that's going to be, because obviously Jonathan Mogbo was not on that radar at all when the season started a year ago, and now he's going to likely have his name called to be USF's first NBA draft pick since 1982. All right, so we'll transition in talking about a little bit about Adama Ball. We'll transition into Santa Clara. So we'll bring in Thomas Dunn and we'll talk more about where Santa Clara is, what the outlook is going to be, and the potential for the Broncos going into next season. All right, I'm happy to bring on Thomas Dunn, who was the sports director at KSCU at Santa Clara. He's also a recent grad of Santa Clara University, so I'm really happy to have him on to talk some Santa Clara Broncos. Thomas, how's it going? How's now freely being out of college been going? And we're on them talking some Santa Clara hoops.
You know, it feels a little bit odd, to be honest, because I can't complain about getting up early to go to class anymore. In the same vein, I also don't get to see my friends every single day. It's just odd doing so many things that you've been repeating for 15 plus years now. You're just like all of a sudden it grinds to a halt, just like that. And I'm still getting used to it now, being in the workforce as it stands. But we'll continue to get used to it and start to travel around and see what the world's got to offer.
Yeah, for sure. Again, congratulations on your graduation. It is an exciting time right around that moment. You end up figuring out that summer doesn't exist anymore, so that's all those academic breaks no longer exist, which there's good and bad, obviously, to the post-college life. But we were talking about Santa Clara, and this Santa Clara squad this past year, we saw really like a kind of like a full overhaul of what the roster was from the year before. And this was a team that seemed to kind of hit the ground running in a lot of ways. We saw them play well against Washington State, win against a tournament level Washington State team. We saw them do well until we hit a couple. They beat Gonzaga. Then they hit some rough patches. They had some injuries. They weren't necessarily they dragged a little bit against San Diego, whatnot. Kind of like recap as you kind of went through this season, the journey that this team was on, and how they kind of met your expectations of what we saw this past season.
I think to start with, you coming off the sustained momentum of having Jalen Williams and Brandon Pajimski in the program. So naturally you're feeling pretty good. you're thinking, okay, how can Santa Clara capitalize off this? How can you continue to maintain the brand that these two guys have helped build for you? And going in this year, I was like, okay, I can reasonably expect the NIT, arguably some deeper teams than Jalen Williams and Brandon Pajimski had at their disposal. Over the course of the season, I can only describe this season as Jekyll and Hyde. Some games and some weeks, you didn't know what Santa Clara team was going to show up. Like you mentioned San Diego. That was a big one of just what just happened. What did I just witness? How can I go bleach my eyes immediately? Going at Portland, like those two games stick out to me. At San Jose State, at Cal, a lot of just areas where you think, not. It's one thing to lose. It's another thing how you lose. And Santa Clara lost in some pretty, we'll just say, not pretty ways. And then, like you mentioned, on the flip side, beating Gonzaga for the first time in over a decade, going to Phoenix and playing in the Suns Arena and beating Washington State, going up to Palo Alto and being an, albeit very mediocre Stanford team, but just going and doing that and understanding what that means for your program. It all felt really good. Beating Oregon down in Florida in that little mini tournament, if you will. Just lots of good, lots of bad, and even sometimes some downright ugly to recap the 2023-24 season for the Santa Clara Broncos.
And the one thing that, I mean, I think there was many people, myself included, who saw that the ceiling for that Santa Clara team was really high, but we also saw that the floor was could also have some lows. And I think they were one of the more not to say up and down teams, but they were from night to night, as you mentioned, like Jekyll and Hyde, that when they were good, they were maybe amongst the best on the entire West Coast. But when they were bad, those turnovers just ended up being so costly, time in, time out over the course of the season. Now, this is a team that is going to bring back a lot of that team as there's some continuity going into this coming year. How do you think like this team is going to be able to kind of adjust under really kind of year two of this solid group under Herb Sendek and kind of grow? Because clearly there were some probably fixable mistakes that you can take into going in the next year.
I think the best part about what you just mentioned is you get a rare type of continuity right now at Santa Clara. One of the few teams I would argue in the country that just hasn't gotten ramrodded by at least the first wave of the transfer portal. For Santa Clara last year, their big issue was consistent shot creation and consistent dribble penetration. We mentioned the turnovers. We mentioned that we're on the smaller side of like guard height and guard width and guard measurements in the WCC and really in the country. For as tall as Santa Clara was in the front court with Johnny O'Neal, Christoph Tilly, Francisco Cafaro, having Brent Napper, Jalen Benjamin as your lead guards could led to some physicality issues in some matchups. I notably think of St. Mary's. They're a team that just winds you down, grinds you down, doesn't matter who you are. And Santa Clara wasn't ready for that type of matchup yet. Whereas at other matchups against like Pepperdine and against Pacific, yeah, they did what they had to do. But having that consistent shot creation against a variation of opponents is what Santa Clara is going to need to take the next step going into next year.
And we saw some of that. We knew that Adama Ball was that guy, but he got banged up in the middle of conference play. And even once he came back, he really didn't look like himself until probably a few weeks into his return. But you mentioned like that dribble penetration. One of the guys who does come in from the transfer portal, a very familiar face for Broncos fans, Carlos Stewart, comes back. I was talking with someone that I got almost half confused. I double-taked on the announcement that Carlos Stewart was coming back and almost confused him with Carlos Marshall and had to kind of focus on, oh wait, it's Carlos Stewart coming back. And obviously we know the performer that he was, and kind of talk about just what he means coming back into the fold, because obviously that's a guy we know has the potential to be an all-league performer.
Yeah, I look at Carlos Stewart and I was having a big grin on my face when I heard that, because I had heard the day before he had actually committed and stuff. I had heard he was back on campus. So I was like, okay, that's interesting. The fact that not only one, he was interested, but also the fact that the coaches in the program are willing to receive him back, because that's not always a two-way street on that front. So to hear that, of everything going around that, okay, Carlos Stewart is back. This is clearly a move that they mean business for in terms of continuing to improve the program. I think of his time at least his first stint on the Mission campus, as he didn't know anything but to go 100% and 100 miles an hour every single second of every single game. And there's some good and bad with that. Carlos Stewart, against teams that he was more athletic than, he would just blow by, and he has some underrated athleticism that you don't think he has. And then there, lo and behold, he's posterizing your center, just putting him into Narnia. Other times he's good off the dribble and pulling up into the mid range, kind of like how Jamal Murray stops on a dime, pulling up from the elbow, was improving his 3-point shot, but in some cases was too fast for his own good, not poised enough to see the floor and just take stock of what he was seeing in terms of just turning the corner, in terms of finding the roll man and things like that. And for me, that's what I want to see from him into this second stint here at Santa Clara. Can he prove that the game has slowed down enough for him to where he can not only be the Energizer Bunny that he was on the floor when he was here the first time, but also help his teammates out in the same vein and keep the offense free flowing as it was these past few years?
I mean, one of the things that, again, kind of we talk about, like progression and his growth. This is a Santa Clara team that's going to be a little on the older side going into next year, which I think is going to benefit them. And again, we talk about that continuity. If you looked around the conference, the teams that largely did better were the teams that were a little bit more, had that continuity across the board. Now, again, maybe last year was a little bit more. It was St. Mary's who had largely that continuity where they brought back, I think it was like 7 of their top 9 players. And that is not the case this year. Gonzaga kind of has that. Santa Clara has that. USF to an extent has that. So it does feel like to me that it's like going in, that expectations probably are going to be a little higher because of that continuity. You can hit the ground running a little bit more. Even though you bring back Carlos Stewart, who may not be familiar with the current cast of characters at Santa Clara, this is a guy who's familiar with the system. He knows what Coach Sendek wants to do. Like this is a guy who kind of like fits in. He knows how he's going to fit kind of in that system and where he kind of needs, what role he needs to play.
Yeah, and it's crazy to think about it, but Santa Clara, at minimum, should finish top 3 in the WCC next year. And if you had told any Santa Clara fan a decade ago of that type of expectation, they'd probably laugh at you in the face and say, what do you want? And I sit here thinking it's kind of crazy myself to look at it like that. Coming into being a student at Santa Clara, I wasn't expecting them to be this type of program. I certainly didn't expect Jalen Williams to take the leap that he did from up until the draft night. I didn't expect the leap that Brandon Pajimski. We didn't even know him as a person yet. He was still on the bench at Illinois when I was entering my years at Santa Clara. It's so many different dynamics have changed for the Broncos and that coaching staff in this program that it feels like a little bit of a, what type of house money are you playing with now that you are expecting a top 3 finish in the WCC? Can you tap on the door of the top 2? Can you split games, win one at home against St. Mary's, and it's okay if you drop one in Moraga? Same thing with Gonzaga. Can you find a way to do that consistently for years on end, continue to build your brand, continue to win in the conference without shooting yourselves in the foot and out of league games, and maybe just one day do enough to where you get your name called on Selection Sunday?
Yeah, and the Santa Clara team has not been, I think it's back to the tournament since 1994. The Steve Nash year was the last time Santa Clara did reach the NCAA tournament. But the Santa Clara team, they do feel like, to me, outside of Gonzaga, St. Mary's, that they have the highest ceiling of any of the other WCC schools. And yes, that does include the new additions of Washington State and Oregon State. That Santa Clara still feels like that, the higher ceiling. And like USF, I think, is right there, but like their ceiling is a little lower on the talent level, at least like the way I kind of like read those two teams. Maybe USF might have the higher floor, but their ceiling isn't as high going in as the Broncos. Now, one of the things we saw over the course of the offseason was Adama Ball trying his hand in the NBA draft, getting his feedback, his return, kind of talking about like his role and his impact of not only that he is making that return, but also the fact that this is a guy who, when we saw him at his best, I mean, this was arguably the best playmaker in the WCC and definitely like the most lethal scorer in the WCC when he was right.
So at face value, of course, getting Adama Ball back is huge. You had a lot of firepower to a team that already had some with Carlos Stewart, Adama coming back. You could feasibly have a starting lineup that fills out with Jake Ensminger, Johnny O'Neal, and Christoph Tilley. I think that's a pretty formidable 5 in the context of the WCC. For Adama, it's about putting things together consistently. And I feel like that's the common theme from last year going into next year. Can Santa Clara do what they did, but consistently, and avoid all the bumps in the road, the forks in the road, turning the ball over like it was charity? Can they find a way to just get rid of all that? Can Adama make sure that he's in tune on defense and locked in? Can he make sure he's rotating off the ball? Is he going to find a way when he's off the ball on offense to make sure that he's involved, whether it's cutting, whether it's setting screens and things like that? Can he continue to find his way? Because when he was asked to lead the lead ball handle last year, there was some good things and there was also some really bad things about that. Can he find a way to be more consistent, not only in his fundamentals, but also in his high speed decision making?
For this team going in, we know, like, everyone knows about Adama Ball. Everyone kind of knows about Carlos Stewart. There's a little bit there. Obviously, there was more buzz going into last year for Christoph Tilly. Who might be some of, like, the guys that did not get as much of, like, the pub last year that we should actually keep an eye on going into this coming year? I mean, I have a couple of names in mind, but I want to kind of get your thoughts on who that might be for that Santa Clara team.
Yeah, so I have a personal bias with glue guys, and you did hear me say his name already. Jake Ensminger is a guy that I'm going to watch because he just makes winning plays. And you think of Gonzaga's Anton Watson when he was there. He just makes winning plays. Alex Dukas, Kyle Bowen when they were with St. Mary's. Let me think of who else. Like, man, I don't have any more that come straight to mind, but still, just guys who continuously make winning plays in a winning program and help make a difference in what you're trying to do. I think of Jake Ensminger against Gonzaga with all the offensive rebounds in the first half at the Levy Center. That comes straight to mind. Are you going to make deflections? Are you going to rotate? Are you going to stand up people who are trying to penetrate down the lane? Jake Ensminger does all that. He rebounds well. He did have a tough sequence at the end of the USF game up at War Memorial, and probably what was one of the more underratedly excited games in conference last year for a multitude of reasons. But those types of experiences and that type of leverage will help build him into the player that he will be next year, because he's someone who can do just a little bit of everything. He can play make a little bit. He can rebound a little bit. Has a little bit of a float game to him. And he's starting to expand his three-point shot. It didn't really take a lot of him last year. But over the course of the year, started to pull the trigger just a bit more and a bit more. And now it's just about putting it all together and continue to be that winning player that he has showcased that he can be.
Yeah, I'm with you on that one. I had Emzinger on my list as for guys that I think next year I'm going to say a huge leap, but you're right, a glue guy that you need to have on a good team. Like, you need your stars, you need your marquee guys, but you need those guys who are going to do the down and dirty work. You need those guys. You mentioned, like, the Anton Watson. Like, Ben Gregg is probably another good example of someone exactly like that. And obviously that he's kind of, the Gonzaga's had so many of those guys over the years. St. Mary's has had a number of those guys over the years. And those are the types of guys that you do need. So yeah, I like Jake Ensminger was one of the guys that, like, I was thinking about as well. As we kind of think about going into, because again, we're only a couple days away from the NBA draft. Obviously, there won't be a Santa Clara player in that mix this time around, but there might be next year if Adama goes back in and then is able to kind of increase his stock this coming year. But there's a couple of WCC guys that are going to be in that mix. You got to see plenty of both of them. Between Jonathan Mogbo and Anton Watson, who are the two who are still in the NBA, who are going to be in the NBA draft, who do you feel like had, like, the greater upside, and then maybe who might be kind of like have that, maybe that higher floor between those two?
I find the higher floor to be Anton Watson without a shadow of a doubt, a guy who has continuously made winning plays, been a thorn in the side of several WCC schools and national powerhouses over the years. And the main difference that tilts in that direction for me is the fact that he's showcasing a little bit more of his offensive game throughout the years at Gonzaga, starting to step out and take those mid-range jumpers, taking the rare three-pointer. I've seen a little more that I saw him walk on senior night and just absolutely take it to the Santa Clara Broncos up in Spokane, up at the first time that I was up in the kennel. What an absolute experience. I know you've had some memories up there. Jonathan Mogbo, he weirdly just had two really rough games against Santa Clara. The first half up in War Memorial just completely shut down, and then the second half took over en route to the comeback win for the Dons. Then the second time around, just completely ineffective, just rendered, I don't want to say useless, but just completely rendered ineffective by Tilly and Caffro and others. So for those reasons, I lean towards Anton Watson is having the higher floor heading into the league, but I would not be shocked to see Jonathan Mogbo come out in like a defensive specialist role. I look at a guy like Peyton Watson on the Denver Nuggets, definitely not the same player, but definitely in terms of someone who can maybe make a similar impact, because Mogbo needs to really develop his offensive game, his offensive aggression outside of 10 feet, and really make sure that he can be a versatile piece that can be used consistently on end for any NBA team.
Yeah, the NBA is a different game, is a different style, and I do think there's something to be said about the way certain guys are used, and I think the way USF needed to use Mobo was definitely different than the type of player he's going to be. Because yeah, using him as a big at the NBA level is not going to work. He's going to need to showcase that outside game a lot more. I mean, that's for any position at this point at the next level. You better have to have that at least be a decent threat from 3-point range to at least keep guys honest and be able to defend out at that range.
Absolutely. Like if you pair Jonathan Mobo's defensive game with like LMU's Alec Merkvaladze's offensive game, we'd be having some different conversations right now. And that's another guy whose name really popped in terms of making winning plays, Merkvaladze from LMU. So if you paired those two together, well, then you never really know. But as it stands, Jonathan Mogbo just needs to really, really expand his offensive game in order for him to stick around and have a meaningful impact.
All right. Well, it was great to be able to chat with you, talk some Santa Clara hoops. Obviously, the Broncos we are a long way off from the start of the season, but this on paper, the Santa Clara team looks like it is primed to be back in the hunt. They're going to have plenty of opportunities in the non-conference. This conference schedule, I think, is going to give a little bit more of an opportunity to make some noise. Obviously, you still have the 2 games against St. Mary's, 2 games against Santa Clara. I need to take a look one more time, but I believe it's also still get the 2 against Washington State, and actually believe still against 2 against Oregon State. I have to double check on every last one a bit. But yeah, the Santa Clara team does look like it is. They and USF, I think, are going to be the neck and neck of who's going to be the next one to make that leap.
Yeah, and for Santa Clara, we've talked about it now. We've been on the tip of the iceberg in terms of getting into some very meaningful postseason play. And that's not to say the NIT is worth nothing now, but it's clearly not what it once was for Santa Clara. And I've been talking with some other people in my circle about, okay, we've made up this set of stairs and getting draft picks up into the league. Now it makes you wonder, when can we get back to March Madness? We've had these draft picks, so we didn't get to make the big dance with them. Now it's time to take that next step and go up the ladder and try and get to the top of the mountain, because at the end of the day, everyone wants to dance, and now it's Santa Clara's time.
All right. Thanks, Thomas, for hopping on. Oh, and those watching, be sure to actually give him a follow on Twitter at Thomas Dunn 24. Great content, knows what he's talking about when it comes to Santa Clara basketball. So once again, thanks for hopping on. It's great to chat with you, and we'll definitely catch up down the road.
Pleasure, Zach. And hey, I'm ready for this. I'm ready for college basketball to be back. I know it's a long ways away, but I would say hands up if you're going to Sioux Falls to see Santa Clara, St. Louis, but I will definitely not be there.
We'll see. Still working on the travel schedule for the fall and for the winter as the schedules start to slowly leak and make their way out. But Santa Clara has some good matchups, so it'll be really fascinating to see how this all ends up breaking down. I want to thank Thomas one more time for hopping onto the podcast. Yeah, this Santa Clara team is going to be fascinating to watch. I mean, I kind of have them. He talked about them being probably the clear number 3. I still think they're probably sitting at number 4, just slightly behind USF, because I think I'm going to trust USF's consistency and their floor versus what I think Santa Clara's higher ceiling is. Santa Clara, I think, is still in the prove it mode. We know the talent that they've had over the last couple of years. I think Carlos Stewart is going to really help that cause going into next year. But there are a lot of little things that they need to tighten up, that they need to do better. This is a team that is consistently now at 20 wins, almost 3 of the last 4 years. So we know what they're capable of. And now it's, can they take that next step? Can they take that next leap to get back into the NCAA tournament, which is somewhere, obviously, where Gonzaga has been for every year for the last 25 years, where St. Mary's has consistently been over the last 20, where USF was just a few years ago. Can Santa Clara get back to the NCAA tournament for their first time since 1994? All right, well, that'll do it for this episode of the unofficial WCC Hoops podcast. Be sure to follow on social media at Post by Zach and also at unofficial WCC pod. Follow the podcast on YouTube, subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, and then also on your favorite streaming services. That'll do it. Thanks for watching, everybody, and I will catch you later.